They'll be calling you a radical. Kevin, Blanch here. I want to talk about the Snowden event and my question that got asked, and I'll tell you how I pulled this dog and pony show. It was very scripted. You could see that he's under heavy controls over there. He's a brilliant guy. He had no intention of being in Russia. You know, he ended up there, and you could see that I mean, he's so brilliant, he'll go down the rabbit hole and cut him off. And now Doug Provisio from Fresh Air, the Koch brothers owned NPR, he was the moderator, and he's a pacifist. We have the two Dougs in Utah are the pacifists. We have pacifists, and I love Doug Provisio. He's awesome. He's a great storyteller. He did a lot of good work on my old friend Everett Ruiz. But then we have Doug Wright, who we know he's a passive-aggressive fearmonger working for the machine. So, but anyway, Snowden would let Doug get a word in edgewise. So anyway, I have a connection up there, and a beautiful, great, really brilliant activist up there, and his beautiful wife bought me a ticket. And so I got up there early, and there she was, and I'm like, well, she says, I got your question, Kevin. And I says, well, did he get it? Yeah, he's got your question. You know, Doug's got your question, so does Snowden, you know, all through them. So Doug's so good, you know, and he has to, he's in Utah, he has to play that freaking card. So Snowden comes on, and Snowden was not about to fucking let him take the field. He was ready, his story needed to be told, and he just went. And I mean went. He went off on Hillary Clinton. Oh, did he ever have. He went on the power structure, and the new information that was said inside there, he said this. He says, this is the new information. He never talked about this before. He talked about the layers of clearance. He talked about how he says you have your normal CIA clearance, then you have another, but he talked about and even used the word for what the clearance is, clear to the top. He had that clearance because he had joined to go fight the Iraqi war, broke his legs, blah, blah, his family. They thought, and he had bought the narrative. He had bought into the surveillance doing this thing to means, but then he says it got clear to the top. And he realized what a pyramid it was, and he started to see what these globalist elites and how they have control are up. And you could see that he's under heavy control in Russia every time he'd get ready to go. And so I could prove how he got my question. He sounded just like me. He went off on the Revolutionary War. He talked about Greek tragedies, he talked about reading around. He talked about laying down his life for it. Just said, you know, he was amazing. But so I sent him in my question a link. My question was this. You released a link saying that the NSA has a program to actually go after activists. They want to get them, not just that they want to kill them. And, you know, anonymous, blah, blah, blah. You released it through The Guardian. Now, it's important that he said this, and he said this over and over and over, that he does not political, and he wanted to, he says, I rely on journalists. He says, I just release my stuff to journalists and they put it out. So I linked the Guardian article in my question to him. So get this. This is how I know he saw my question. He gets to that point and he starts talking about activists. He lays down the very link that I sent him. He lays down a copy of it at the Guardian, talking about it. And he says, and then he talked about, he says, any activist that's championed the underprivileged, and he talked about private versus public, and he talked about anybody who's crashing that club at the top, they are going after them big time and hardcore. Now, you could see he was under heavy repression. He's a smart dude. He can't just say what he wants. He's in Russia. He had no intention to go to Russia. Remember, they surrounded the plane. And so he would cut it off. And he never let Doug get a fucking question in edgewise. Now, I sat with Miss Kelly, who was the Mormon activist who took on the priesthood. Her dad, you can see where he got he's a brilliant guy. And there were standing ovations in there. He's the real deal. He's one of us. He talked about the Revolutionary War, and I loved it when he said this. He says, we don't need the masses. He says 35% of the United States population believes that the, you know, rotation of the sun and the earth. You know, he went off on that. That the, you know, so, and he talked about how the Revolutionary War was 3% of the people fought, and he talked about if King George would have had surveillance, it would have never happened. And he talked about 70% of the population did not want to fight that war. And he happened anyway. He talked about all, you know, he talked revolution. he got very optimistic at the end. He says, I was going to weigh down my life in 2013, but he said, then he went off on Hillary. Doug asked him, he says, well, in the Democratic debate, Hillary and Bernie were both asked about you, and then he really went off on the, and Doug said it. He says the ex-head of the NSA says not only that you should be tried for treason, but you should be hung. And there's plenty of people who say over and over, you should be hung. And it kind of set him off. And he says, well, he didn't mention Bernie, didn't mention Trump, didn't mention anybody. He says, oh, Hillary, he says, you know, isn't that funny? The two sets of rules. And he really talked about it. He says, her email, she could do whatever, but media, and he didn't talk about himself. He says he talked about the media. So the two set of rules, he talked about, you know, them going after Snowden, Assange, you know, but he was very careful. Every time he'd go down a rabbit hole, he would stop. Look, we need him to stay alive. We need him so much, and I know that he has an insurance policy. The only reason he's alive, is they know that he has, and he said it many times. I die, I'm going to release it. Putin's not going to raid, because let's get real, Putin is the fucking club. And remember, he had no intention, but he was awesome. And I know he got my question, and he confirmed it. They have programs to go after us, and he talked about the levels of surveillance. You know, these guys have the clearance, and he got all the way to the top, and he talked about what he saw. And I'm sure that public television, you know, Koch brothers bought on. He talked about the division between public and private and how it's not anymore. He talked about the elite club power structure that runs this whole country. And then he really got into the so-called terrorism in Paris and there, because these guys said, well, you caused that. And he says, let me tell you how I proved that. And then he went into the NSA call center, or excuse me, the NSA collection center in Utah, and he says, I could prove that it's not there to fight terrorism. He says, it's there to collect data and control you. That's what it's there for. He says, it's all, he talked about how they collect data, why they collect data, and he said the number one thing to collect data, their best tool is Skype, he said. Of course, he went off on Facebook, he went off on them all, and he said, talked about how it works. But he says, I could prove that it doesn't work, and they're not there. He says they have no intention of tracking terrorists. He talked about the Paris, how they use unencrypted phones. They were posting stuff all over Facebook, they're whatever. He says they don't even watch for terrorism. They're there for the global elites and the power structure to control you. And then he talked about King George and the American Revolution. So he got my question. He was great. It was powerful stuff, but as activists, he confirmed it. They're going after it, and I can prove this. In the conclusion, I'll say this. This is just my thesis, but I believe it's true that Ken Bueller and these scientists, you know, they're not scientists, come out with their data. This is 1,860 videos I've had. I've never had this happen to me. And I know that they've suppressed my view count. I did that video on Ken Bueller's study right as it came out. It had 552 views within an hour. Then all of a sudden the next day it drops to 414 views. So I go to my real-time analytics, showed 3,500 views, then it showed 38, then it showed 55. It's still showing. That's never happened to me. Days later, same with my video about Snowden. So he said he's optimistic. He said it like this. When they said about him, he says, well, if all they got is an old guy sitting on his porch rattling his cane, that I should be hung, they got a problem. Because I'm optimistic, because this technology, he talked about social media, spreads across borders so quickly, and people have access to it, and he talked about we need to protect it. So it was awesome. He got my question, obviously, and so we need him to stay alive. Snowden Manning 2016. Thank you to Doug. Thank you for everybody that did it. You know, we have Doug and Doug. We have the passive-aggressive monster. We're all passive. I'm not a pacifist. But the good pacifist, Doug, they all like this in the club. I don't want in the club, but he's in the club, the Koch brothers P.B.S, which isn't public. But K.S.L, the Mormon Church, he talked about how these guys just feed this. You know, that's what they work. They're passive-aggressive. So it was cool. Thanks, everybody. Stay tuned.